I'll pick it up. Yeah. Sure. Christine,
The link is important.
Good evening and welcome to the December 9th, 2024 Finance Committee meeting of the Hartford Board of Education. Thank you for being here tonight. We're excited that you joined us. Tonight, we have a new face at the table, so we're just going to go ahead and do quick introductions. I am Jen Hockenhall, the board chair, and I will pass it off to Tyrone.
Hi, thanks, Jen. Hi, this is Tyrone Walker, second vice chair of the Hartford Board of Ed, and welcome.
Nice to meet you in person.
Yes.
Hello, Leslie Torres Rodriguez, superintendent. Welcome. I am so excited. Happy that you are here. Hello, everybody.
And yes, I'm Caitlin Richard. I'm the new chief financial officer. Started last Monday and really excited to work with you all.
Board members on the phone, can we start with Ruth if you're available?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Ruth Fortune, and I am a fellow board member.
Shantae? Sorry.
Good evening, Shantae Brody, board member.
Hi, Shantae, thanks. Stephen?
Stephen Wilson, board member. Nice to meet you.
And Francois?
Good evening, everyone. Francoise Daracel Ledger, vice chair.
Thanks, Francois. And that's Corey, who's walking.
Sure,
There you go. All right. Thank you for that quick round of introductions. And with that, I will turn it over to the superintendent.
I'm actually going to turn it over to Deputy Foster.
I'm going to turn it over to Caitlin.
Excellent.
How quick did that happen?
So quick.
What a hot potato.
You did have a good onboarding. I'm just saying.
No, I really did. I had all the conditions for success.
Thank you.
Okay, so the first agenda item today is going to be going over our October financial report. I know you all received a more detailed report, but we're going to try a new format this time of presenting some of the key information and insights via slides. And again, I have only been here a week, but I've spent some time digging into this. And these were some of the views that helped me get a handle on what was happening. So I'm hoping they can also be helpful to you. And open to any other views you'd like to see, questions you have, everything like that. So with that, I think, yep, so we'll start with that financial report, and then we have a few other items that we'll get into after that. So this is the executive summary. I'm going to go into more detail on the subsequent slides, but just some key points to ground you. Overall, our revised budget across all funds is around $442 million. Something to remember about that is it's significantly less than last year's. That's largely driven by the fact we don't have ESSER funds this year. So that's important to know just as we look at monthly expenses. Overall, we anticipate spending less this year. As we look at our FY25 25 expenses, we have some unrealized revenue assumptions and some additions to the budget, which means we're anticipating ending with a deficit. Right now, that number is between 15 and 16 million. I'm going to give more information about this number, what's driving it, and how we think we can mitigate at least part of it through some vacancy savings, but want to make you all aware of that. So that will be a piece of our discussion. And then when we just look at those October month end, that's part of what we're using to analyze our current expenses and to think about the next year. We'll go into detail on that, but you can see we've spent about $2 million more this year at this time than last year at this time. But I'll get into what's driving that because the more is actually based on timing differences, not actually on increased expenditures compared to last year. So I think an overall takeaway is that we're anticipating spending more than last year, less than last year, but slightly more than we predicted in our initial budget, and we'll go into why we think that is. And feel free to also stop me at any time and also pause at the end of this. So this first view is looking at our expenses from last year, that's that yellow line, compared to our expenses for this year, which is the blue line. The dotted portion is just projected, so we only have expenses through October month end. And the insight from this graph is that we're largely similar to last year in terms of our overall expenses for October. You can see the yellow and blue line are basically on top of each other. But we do anticipate that after this time, we will end the year with lower total expenses than last year. So every month we're going to be tracking how close we are relative to that projection, so we know how much we're deviating from what we thought was going to happen. When you break down those October expenses, so hopefully you can see some of these categories, but this is just looking at October of this year compared to October of last year, broken out by major object category. So this helps tell the story of where we're actually seeing some of the differences. And what you can see in the first two sets of bar charts, so again, that orange is this year, blue is last year. In salaries, both certified and non-certified, we're seeing lower spend compared to last year. So that was intended. There was a lot of position reductions during this year. There's also some vacancies. So you can see, as intended, we're spending less overall on people than we were at this time last year. We're also spending less overall on professional contracts and services and purchase property services. Some of that is because of the decrease in ESSER that was funding a lot of those contracts are no longer here. A few more things I'll point out is that you'll see a slightly higher spend on system-wide purchase services. Largely that is because of transportation payments, but it's more of a timing piece than it is an actual anticipated higher spend in that category. In supplies and materials, that's where utilities falls. We are spending more on utilities at this time this year compared to last year, and that's because utility expenditures are actually higher than what we initially predicted. So when we look at the drivers of that FY25 deficit, we'll see utilities as one of the line items there. And we can see as of now, we are spending more on that category. That final bar chart over to the right, sundry, I dug into what this meant because I did not know what that meant, but that is our fringe and benefits. What it's showing here is that we're spending $6 million more. That actually is due to timing differences. So it's a way we book our different benefits and expenditures, and it's not actually, as of now, a true increased cost that we're anticipating. It's more just the timing by which that happens. So now, that was just this year compared to last year. Something else that I looked at to better understand the trends in the budget is I actually went back a few fiscal years to see how expenditures varied over time. So what you see on this graph is expenditures back to FY21, and then inclusive of the first few months of this year, what it looked like over time. And something that's interesting is you can see expenditures essentially track similar to each other up until about November. And then there's lots of differentiation between expenditures after that point. The reason I share this is because it's going to be important for us to keep in mind as we look at expenditures in the spring that there's been a lot of variation historically in those expenditures month to month. Part of that was ESSER, so we had a lot more ESSER dollars that were spent in the previous fiscal year. But one of the biggest drivers, actually, if you go to the next slide, Christina, this is looking at just tuition payments. So tuition is a major portion of our budget. And tuition varies a lot in terms of the timing of payments, and that is what is driving a lot of the differences in timing. And so that's something we'll have to keep in mind as we compare this year to last year, is looking at those timing differences. And I know, Paul, you had mentioned there was a change last year in doing it by batches, and I don't know if you just want to explain that in this chart.
Yeah, I was actually pleased to see the yellow line, which is last fiscal year. You see those two big jumps. That was actually, we did some intentional work, particularly with CREC. Around the timing of our tuition payments, where we basically set up a schedule for the year where we had two cycles. We essentially had a December, January cycle and a May, June cycle to get those tuition bills paid to make sure we were paying them as expeditiously as possible so we can close out the year. So that's why you see last year looking a little different, where we had a lot more of the tuition paid earlier in the year, which I'm sure Craig also appreciated from a cash flow standpoint. But you see those two big jumps. That was a reflection of those two cycles we established. Right.
Yeah. Question. So that mustard colored line, the yellow line, that was last year?
Correct.
Okay, that's not totally clear. Okay, the blue line is gonna be this year.
Yep, sorry, it's down at the bottom, but we
Yeah.
can make that more clear.
No, I see it. No, in my head, I'm trying to figure 23, 24, 24, 25.
Oh, yes,
What are we
got it,
trying to
yes,
say?
yes.
And we'll be saying it.
Yes.
I got you. So I did have, I would say based on what you're saying, so Caitlin.
Yeah, nailed it. That was good.
Is to, so, part of where I'd like to get, still maybe look at the simplified, line item budget. Two is to understand kind of your strategy, kind of, because what Paul talked about is the strategy. And part of what would be good to come out of this in terms of, is to understand your strategy. So ahead of time, we can see, okay, here's our strategies for the year. And then we're actually looking at how our strategies play out as we go through the year.
Yep.
And we can see like, oh yeah, that strategy worked out, or oh, that strategy didn't work out, let's change it next year. Because the one thing that, if you go back to the slide we talked about before, that sundry, and thank you for, because I too have no idea what sundry
Yeah, I was like, what is this?
is, but that timing is significant enough off that I'm trying to figure out like that would signal to me that maybe our planning wasn't totally right there, or the strategy, we took a different strategy along the way, or something somehow changed between what we thought and what actually happened.
I can speak to just that specifically.
Yeah.
I think certainly when you see a variation like that in some of the other categories, I think we raise red flags for me. Fringe is just, we're all self-insured, and so we're basically making payments, literally, we get a weekly bill from Anthem for all of the health insurance claims for all of our employees, for all the health care claims for all of our employees. And so it really does, like, in many ways, the timing fluidity with Fringe is literally a function of when people are accessing services, or we might have I'll say a workers' compensation settlement as an example, or there's so much that's in Fringe liability, right? So if we have a liability settlement, so there's a lot of things that are just, we pay it when the bill comes, right? But there's a lot of variation from one year to the next.
So keep a pin there. So part of what my visioning in terms of the board with this is that there's some time spent in finance committee meeting, talk about how the budget is constructed. Because what you just said is something that comes out when I understand how you constructed the budget, and then to understand that, oh, that's just not gonna be very controllable. So we just need to get educated that that can have high variation. But other things will have very low variation, that we can control it a lot. Yeah, I haven't totally worked out that. Now that you're here, we can talk about that a little bit. What we've done in the past is that somehow you plan the whole budget out, and then somehow from December through like January, you try to jam all this knowledge into the board. It just becomes challenging. And so I was thinking we move towards next year, because realistically, you start planning like in July. You start planning that pull us along little bits at a time, and then we're a little bit smarter by that December, January time frame. And because everything you said totally made good sense.
Yeah, and the benefit too is that I'm learning at least the Hartford context for this. And so I think that learning alongside you all can be helpful. Like as I learn things, sharing that with you all and then getting more questions. And so totally hear you that we can use this time over the course of the year to be doing that type of work so that everyone can engage and we're actually building a budget. Any other questions on this part? I'm about to get into some of those drivers of the FY25 deficit, but any other questions on what we've gone through so far? You jump to the next slide. So this slide has, again, in that 15 to 16 million predicted deficit, what is driving it? I'll highlight some of the major categories here because the first two are actually unrealized revenue. So the first is that we plan to spend around 5 million out of ESSER funds this year. It was actually all expended in FY24. So exciting that we spent all of the ESSER funds, but it just wasn't available for this year to cover other things. And then Paul is gonna go into more detail on the non-lapsing fund in a bit. So I'm not gonna get in too much detail here, but there was also a plan to use some of the non-lapsing fund, but that was expended on other unanticipated expenses. So Paul will get into that piece, but those two make up the majority of the deficit, and those are kind of unrealized revenue. Another piece is what I named before is the increase in projected utility costs. So that's about a 2.5 million increase. And this was something I believe, Paul, we found out after the budget was posted from the city on that front. So those are some of the biggest categories. I'll also highlight there have been some additional expenses aligned to key strategic areas. So you can see signing bonuses for teachers in critical areas, signing bonuses for paraeducators, for student teachers. So some of this too has just been with the vacancies we've been seeing, the need to dedicate additional dollars to that. So it's a combination, like I said, unrealized revenue assumptions, and then also just some deliberate choices made in areas we really needed to increase the budget. I will name that we're doing a more in-depth analysis of a year-end projection, but we did start looking at some of our vacancies, and we do think that about 6 to 8 million of this 15.6 million deficit will end up being covered through vacancy savings. So we are seeing teacher vacancies that are higher at this time this year than last year. We made some assumptions that we fill those starting in the spring, because that's what we hope to do. And then our paraeducators as well, seeing vacancies in that category, but seeing more hiring trends as of late now that the candidate pool is broader. So I will name probably 6 to 8 million of this we think we can solve in vacancies, but there will be another portion of that we're gonna have to figure out how to mitigate.
May I, this is Ruth Fortune. In terms of these allotments for bonuses, this is what we anticipate spending, and I would assume a good chunk of that has not been spent yet because we actually haven't hired a whole lot of new people, correct?
So I can speak to that. Yes, that's correct. Particularly, I mean, on the teacher front, but keep in mind, for reasons of equity, we're paying the signing bonus to anyone who was hired new to the Hartford Public Schools for the start of this school year. So somebody who got hired in July as a first-time teacher or paraeducator in the Hartford Public Schools, we are paying the bonus to, because we weren't going to like not pay the bonus to somebody who joined us at the start of the year and only pay it to people who join us now. So we have spent some of this money already.
But within those areas, like it's not everyone.
Sure.
It's not everyone, it's only so special education, bilingual,
Shortage
TESOL,
areas.
shortage areas among teachers. And then for paraeducators, I will say on the paraeducator front, we have had, I want to say since we announced the additional supports, including the 12 months to pass the Para Pro, the signing bonus for paraeducators, I think we've onboarded about 30 and have another 7 to 10 who are onboarding kind of as we speak. So we actually have had significant movement on the paraeducator front. Teachers are a little bit harder mid-year. There just aren't as many teachers out there looking for work in December. And so we have not had as much recent movement on the teacher front.
Okay, that's good to know. So we've about 37 new paras have been added, or 30 have been added and 7 are in the process of being added.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, that's news to me. I've been curious as to what has happened. Okay. All right, thank you for the update.
And that number is actually higher than what I thought. So the team must have moved even fast, and more, because I think we're at 27 the last time I checked.
I don't know. 30 is the number I have for the last 4 weeks. Then I know there's 7 in the pipeline.
That's great.
There may be more. 7 in the pipeline was as of last week. There may
That's
be
great.
more.
Okay, that's good.
Any other questions before Paul gets into the non-lapsing fund?
Okay. All right. So I'm going to be the bearer of less good news. Well, I guess Caitlin's exactly
Mine
bearing
was
good
too.
news. But as you all know, we came to you at the October board meeting and we voted to withdraw, I'm not going to go to the penny, but 3.6 million from the non-lapsing fund to close out FY24. So that was to bring the balance sheet for FY24 to 0. Unfortunately, after that time, we were became aware of transportation invoices for our transportation vendor that had not been processed, that were for services provided in the 23-24 school year. And so as a result of that, we then went from balanced to not balanced because we can't pay services from the 23-24 year with the 24-25 budget. And so as that necessitates us coming back to you, and I'm previewing this because it'll be on the agenda at the December 17th meeting to withdraw essentially an additional 1.3 million from the non-lapsing fund. So that will bring us to about 4.9, close to 5 million of the non-lapsing fund that we'll need to balance FY24. In the slides that Caitlin just shared, you already saw we had that placeholder of 5 million as the unrealized amount of the non-lapsing fund that we'd be able to use to balance the current year. And so that's already reflected in our projection for this current year. But I just wanted you to be aware, and certainly happy to take any questions about that, but wanted you to be aware why there's going to be a December vote to increase that amount. I will say that this also gets voted by the city council, but positively, I guess, in the city council's case, they simply took a vote authorizing us to withdraw up to the full amount of the fund. And so they didn't put a specific dollar amount when they voted, so we don't have to go back to the council. But because the motion we brought before you all was, I think, to the penny, we got to come back in next week and increase that amount.
Question, just in my head, can you remind me, what's in that non-lapsing fund? What is that?
Yep, happy to. So essentially, the way by ordinance, and I think by state statute, boards of education, we're not allowed to retain a surplus. So if we, end the year $10 million in the black, it goes back to the city. We don't get to keep it. The one exception to that is there's a provision that allows us to put up to 2% of our general fund as a set aside into this non-lapsing fund. So that's essentially our limited ability to retain a surplus. And so that 2% of our general fund is about 5.6 million.
Right, so I guess, yes, let me just say it jogged my
Yeah.
memory. Only question I have, we didn't talk about last time is that money, like, unless you spend it in like the upcoming year, or can that money just sit there parked?
It can sit there,
Multi-term.
it'll stay as long as we leave it there.
Okay.
Obviously, it's gonna be down to 600,000 or so
Sure,
after.
but it's not use or lose, it's.
Right.
It's a-
And if we were to run, because Caitlin's here now, if we run a surplus this year,
Right.
we will, we have the ability to put that money back in the non-lapsing fund. Not to put that on you, Caitlin.
No, that's my goal, yeah.
I think it was a year in which there was.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure.
Carried over.
Well, there's also years
On
in
the
which we
total
return
thing.
significant
And then
money to
we-
the city, where we've had a surplus, we don't get to keep it.
I have a question.
Yes.
How, do we know how we missed the invoice? Was it just a late billing by the vendor or?
And when you answer that, can you also talk about moving forward what the request was?
Yeah, so it was sort of a two-parter. It's a good question. The invoices did come very late from the vendor, but honestly, they came in time for us to have got it in for the last vote. The reality is they didn't get processed as quickly as they should have in the communication between the transportation department and the finance department. I'm not gonna go into the weedy details of the personnel side of that, but what I will say is that the action going forward is historically with our transportation vendor, we've always had the invoices go straight to the transportation department. And that was for a specific reason where we didn't want our accounts payable team to pay a bill unless we had confirmed that the service was provided, because there's a lot with field trips, right? Like, field trip gets scheduled, then it gets canceled, but with the transportation vendor inadvertently sends a bill. But going forward, the change we're making to our process is, yes, those invoices will go to the transportation department when they're sent from the vendor, but they will also go to our accounts payable department. They'll go to both.
Yeah.
Our accounts payable department still won't pay it unless they get the green light from the vendor. But the advantage that gives us is then if there's bills that are sort of sitting out there that we haven't paid, accounts payable has visibility into it and they can follow up with transportation. So that's kind of where the miss was. That's the correction going forward.
Okay, that's still correct.
Thank you.
So the next one, this is recent information because we have a 12/1 filing deadline with the state and Board Member Walker. To your point about just continuing to sort of add information as we have it. I just want to give you an update on the fiscal year 25. So that's 24-25 school year excess cost grant. and just give you an update on where we are with that and what the dollars look like, because particularly as we go into the legislative session next month, I know that we've been talking a lot about special education costs, and so I just want you to have the background on this. And so this first slide is just, I won't read all of this to you, but this is a recap of what the excess cost grant is. And so, you know, as you see in the first bullet, what this is the state saying, hey, if the costs to the district of an individual student with disabilities exceed a certain threshold, the state's going to step in and cover that cost. We'll cover a portion of that cost, right? So it's a grant that we get every year that helps with that. Currently, the way the statute is, the grant is intended to cover the cost 4.5 times our average per pupil expense. So there's a calculation that determines what our average per pupil expense is, multiply it times 4.5 times. The grant is supposed to cover the cost above that number for any student who exceeds that threshold. And so you can see that's not our actual number, but you see my example, right? If our average per pupil cost was $20,000, the excess cost grant is intended to cover any costs for that student above 90,000, right? Being the 4.5 times threshold. That is, however, you guys know this well, subject to appropriation. And so the legislature annually appropriates money in their budget for the excess cost grant. The state collects all of the information from all of the districts, and they determine, well, how much is the total amount that's needed? How much did we actually get appropriated from the legislature? And you can see in my example, in 23-24 school year, the state covered 76.25% of the excess cost amount we were owed. And that's simply a matter of appropriation, right? So the amount appropriated wasn't sufficient to pay 100% of the costs above 4.5 times for the entire state. And so they set a threshold. There is a tiering. So we do get a higher percentage than, say, a wealthier district. But we still don't get the full 100%. Just the last bullet I think is important, because on the next slide, I'm going to give you our data for 24-25. There are students who are called agency placements, where DCF is involved in the decision about where the student is placed for their educational services. In those cases, the grant is supposed to cover all of the costs above the average per pupil. So again, in my 20,000, 90,000 example, for an agency placed student, the excess cost grant is intended to cover all of the costs above the 20,000.
You said supposed to.
Well, because the 76.25 still applies.
Gotcha. Okay.
So last year, even for agency placed students, we got 76.25% of the costs above the average per pupil cost.
Gotcha.
All right, so question here, to make a comment. It may not be quite just this factor, but the state has acknowledged that it's never quite met 100% funding for us. I thought though they had an anticipated year where they would finally hit the target. You remember? Did they? I feel like, right, I feel like, so
But
next
still.
year, I mean, but
Well, but I think we're talking about two things. You're talking about ECS.
yeah, but the same mentality comes into play, because to me, you're always gonna have an appropriation issue. So I'm just like, to me, that doesn't feel like
We're behind.
an excuse. And so I guess I would ask,
I would agree.
I mean, really honestly,
Yeah.
I mean, if you're a needy district, you actually need the money. Are they bookkeeping it then to say, okay, at some point, we're finally gonna make you whole, or is that just kind of, right, fiction? Because otherwise, then we'll never, that's why I'm asking the question. Because if that's the case, can we add this to that's the first item I want to talk about with our legislative group.
I think there's a couple of things there. Like, yes, to my knowledge, there's not been any kind of statement around, we're just gonna make a commitment to perpetually fund it 100%. And then if I go to the next slide, the other thing that I think is a legit question to be asking is, why is it 4.5 times?
I think, Ms. Brody, did you have a question?
Oh, sorry.
Yes, I did. Are you able to hear me okay? Have we ever gotten like a report out or anything where it shows like our revenue from our rentals of our facilities? Where does that lie?
Speak to that. We could produce something on that. We have a fund where monies are deposited when somebody uses one of our facilities. And so we could certainly provide what that looks like. But it basically goes in a fund that we then use for facilities or
Okay.
maintenance projects. So if there's some kind of upkeep that's needed in the building, we can draw on that fund.
That also cover like overtime for people who are using.
And
Yeah,
I
we-
have,
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry. I didn't know y'all still was answering. You went kind of low.
Sorry, talk louder. Sorry, go ahead.
So I hear the answer to that was yes, it's somewhere, right?
We can provide. it.
So if this I'm curious to see, but also on another note, I'm interested to know of our programming, and I'm gonna say in particular, so it won't be for this meeting, but because and the reason why I asked about the rentals is because every time I get my daughter from track, there's a line of parents to pick up from Weaver's Aquatic Center, and it's Kingswood Oxford students. So I don't know, are we creating programs that our kids could have the opportunity to use our facilities, and how does that whole makeup? I'm just so interested in that. So I don't know what committee that would fall under, how that looks, but we have a brand new facility, and if others are taking advantage of it more than we are, and we're not creating these things for our own students, that's a concern to me. So I just wanted to get that in.
We could do two things. One is connect with our athletic director to see what the next phase of the swimming aquatics programming is. And I also know that the way it works when external partners request is that the team looks, obviously we prioritize internal programming first, and then if there's nothing going on, that's when the team says, okay, you can rent it for this amount of time for this amount of money. So we can do those two things. Check in with athletic director, because I thought that they were gonna move in the spring to have competitive swimming at both the high schools. And obviously 3 high schools when Buckley is on.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that. Even if it's not, even if it's to learn how to swim, like that is a thing in our community with our students, because we see sometimes, unfortunately, we have the tragedies of, kids sneaking into some of the Hartford pools and then accidentally drowning. So we have a facility, a brand new, facility. So if we have to figure out ways for our students to capitalize on that part. So we're not saying, okay, if there's nothing going on, someone can use it. But if we're not promoting or trying to create something for something to be going on, to even pique kids, interest, and just open up a world to them that they probably didn't even think of prior to, or it could be just unique or cool. It could be community. I don't know, but I just, every time I pull up and I'm like, what are we doing, with our facilities, as opposed to someone else saying, I'm definitely trying to, I don't fault them, but I want to know what we're doing. So that would be a good follow-up, with the athletics department to learn more.
You got it.
Go ahead, Tyrone, and then we've got people with their hands up online too.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
So, a quick follow-up. I would suggest let's elevate this one issue of water safety instructor with the city. The city acknowledged they cut funding for water safety instructor training. They kind of stifle the number of certified lifeguards you have floating around the city. And so there's some community functions that are easy to accomplish when you have a ready, group of young people who are trained lifeguards. And so I think the city's keen to make some commitment to bring that back. And so if the school could work in concert with that to, build that capability, kind of Sean's base point, we could do community-based stuff too, but you gotta have staff to do it.
Well, I think the city will state that it's the board who should start it. So what the city has said multiple times is that we don't have lifeguards because you guys aren't teaching kids how to swim over here.
Oh,
Oh. That's how I want to get that straight, that's what I'm saying, because me,
Well,
that's
people
that's
in the city. I'm not-
right, that's what I'm saying, it feels like so hence, it feels like an opportunity for some coordination to take place, so that we're all moving in the same direction.
Excellent point.
Sorry, I don't know who's the answer.
yeah, that's the next one. Board member Darrell Ledger.
All right, board member Darrell Ledger.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good. So I just wanted to, like what Tyrone just said, I wanted to kind of piggyback on what board member Brody mentioned, when she talked about the pool and the aquatics, lifeguard training. That would definitely it would be great if that was offered for, Hartford Public School students, so that they can generate some income during the summer, when the pools are open. Also, having someone, I know there's I guess this issue of folks not knowing how to swim or swimming lessons not being offered, but that would, I was thinking definitely about the lifeguard training for our young people. That's all I wanted to,
Are there any other hands?
It was board member Wilson, but he put his hand down, so I think it was the answer or.
Okay.
Real quickly.
Oh,
I mean,
sorry.
not that this is the best time to not talk about it, but I feel like finance maybe is not the best time to talk about citywide swimming. So whoever's committee is in charge of that type of thing, we should add that to their agenda. Who's going to, policy,
Family.
Well,
family?
Family community engagement?
yeah,
I feel like we should add, no?
I just have a clarifying question about Ms. Brody's question, if it was relative to citywide
Right.
or enrichment after-school programming for our students, or both.
I think it's sort of,
I think both.
It should be both.
And the reason that it should be here is she was approaching it from the perspective of it being a source of marginal revenue or gain for us.
well, I think then the second part of her comment, not to just speak for her, because I'm sure she can say herself, but if other people are doing it and using our spaces, that is time that our community cannot then use our spaces. So that, I think the flip side of that is what we want to generate revenue, but not at the expense of our own community using the space.
Yes.
And then the next part of that is, nobody knows how to swim, why? Not me, I'm a great swimmer, obviously, but,
Well, we so much of it was tied to funding shortages.
Right.
As opposed to us not having available
But so-
aquariums or swimming
Right?
pools.
Right.
Facilities are there.
They're there.
So I think that needs to be a longer conversation internally and with the city to figure out, okay, guys, you say you don't have lifeguards, we also don't have lifeguards, how do we kickstart this program again in a manner that we are both equally doing this thing to teach our children how to swim, and then also teaching them how to be lifeguards, which then over the summer teaches people how to swim in this cyclical thing that
So-
somehow lost a year.
So through the chair, you recognize me, I'm gonna ask this to maybe table that as was recommended by Board Member Mills, maybe for FCME, because I know within the last couple of months, I was approached by the new sports and recreation group about how do we better coordinate with the school district. That was like FCNE, I think that's what you're kind of getting at. So maybe we table it and bring it back and maybe ask them to come speak to us and FCNE. How to make that happen.
Excellent idea, love it, I'm not in charge, but love it.
Okay, Ms. Brody, did you have another comment, question?
Yes, I don't want mines to get lost. My focus is Hartford public school students.
That's what I heard.
Yeah.
That's the number one priority for me. So I'm looking for that to be a discussion first and a focus and then the other stuff. Because we could get lost in the other stuff. I'm looking for opportunities as it relates. First, you have for the students in the building of this aquatic center. Second, for our students, period, just to learn and know more. That's my focus. So I just wanted to make sure that that's what I'm trying to get clarity on.
Thanks for clarifying that, Shante. Okay. Are we good to keep going? Or are there any more hands raised? I'm sorry, I really can't.
No.
Okay, all right, Paul.
Okay. So having given the background on the excess cost grant, I just want to walk through some numbers. So I'm gonna explain what's here first and then interpret it. But I've given you 2 fiscal years, so 23-24 last year, 24-25. And the reason I'm bringing it right now is we have a deadline on December 1 of each year. We share with the state, it's a projection. We say to the state, we think this number of students are their cost for these students is gonna exceed the 4.5 times threshold. So we have to identify that on December 1. There's a true up in March. But essentially the numbers we give the state on December 1 and everybody else in the state gives on December 1 is what the state uses to figure out, well, how far can we stretch the money that was appropriated? And so I also want to just caveat here, I'm giving you 23-24, so last year. I'm giving you 24-20, which is the actuals from last year. 24-25 is our December 1. The 76.25 is last year's percentage. We don't know this year's percentage yet, but for purposes of this exercise, I wanted you to see what that translates to in dollars. And so just going left to right on the columns, I mentioned the difference between agency and district. So agency placed students, that's DCF, is involved in the placement and the state pays a larger share. District is where the state picks up after 4.5 times the per pupil. So you can see that what is the threshold in last year, what's our threshold for this year? In terms of what they're identifying as our net per pupil. That number, 23,000, is high, and we're actually trying to get clarity from the state on where they came up with that number. And if they included ESSER spending
Which number?
in our per pupil, the 23,141 as our per pupil expenditure
Oh, I see.
in 24-25, that feels high to us. And we're hopefully didn't include ESSER spending when they figured out our net per pupil cost. So we're checking on that. But the next column is the number of students above the threshold. And then you can see the cost of those students. So you see tuition, transportation, and total. So if I would just take the first line for explanatory purposes, there were 37 students who met the excess cost criteria in 23-24 who were agency placed. Their total cost for that 37 students was our total cost, I'm sorry, for those 37 students was $3,283,968. And then there's the amount we pay, which is whatever is below the threshold, that 4.5 times threshold. And the excess cost is the amount above that threshold. And then the very last column is applying that percentage to say, so again, in the 23-24, our total was 256 students above the threshold. Total cost for that 256 students was $34 million, almost $35 million. We have to pay, regardless of whether the state fully funds it. We're on the hook for $22.8 million for those 256 students. The state's share, based on the excess cost calculation, is $11.9 million. But because they aren't appropriated to cover the full 100% of that cost, what the state actually gave us was $9 million. So translate that to the current fiscal year, we have 272 students who are going to exceed the excess cost threshold. And we actually are tracking up to 389 students, because I mentioned there's a true up in March. There could be as many as 389 students who exceed. But right now we're at 272. That's at a cost of $41 million. I want to be really clear at the stop at this point, just when we talk about the advocacy piece, we're talking about 272 students accounting for $41 million of our budget.
And these are only the ones that are above.
Yes.
Okay.
Right. So if a student, if the individual cost for a student is $90,000, they're not in here at all. We're just paying the $90,000. So our of that 41 million for those 272 students. So just rough math, right? That's $151,000 per student for these 272 students. Our share of that, based on the excess cost calculation, is 25 million. So, you know, if they fully funded the excess cost grant, we would still pay $25 million for these 272 students. The excess cost is 16. If the percentage is the same as last year, we would get an excess cost grant of 12 million. So against the $41 million in cost for these 271 students, 72 students, the state is likely to chip in about 12. and then we pay the rest. So that's really, that was in on excess costs unless there's questions, but I just want to make sure as we talk about advocacy and the legislature, I want to make sure you have the most recent numbers on where we are. And the other thing I'll just highlight is, this is from one year to the next. So from last school year to this school year, our total cost for students who are exceeding our threshold is going from 34 million to 41 million. So when we talk about our structural fiscal issue and tuition, right, we had some conversation about like our tuition last year was above what we projected and budgeted, right? That was one of the things that contributed to our deficit last year. It's these kind of numbers that are driving that. So
question, those two, I should say those two numbers. I know there's a slight increase, 256 to 272, but it still looks like there's been a significant increase in the actual tuition and in the transportation that feels like almost beyond the inflation rate.
oh, certainly beyond it. Yes, for sure.
So, can we at least bookkeep that so folks know that like this situation is causing a certain deficit for us, regardless of how much planning we do? It sounds like you're saying we're gonna absorb a deficit every year just for this one activity.
Yes, I am saying that. And I mean, I think that to dig into that, we are digging into why are the costs going up so much? And as you pointed out, there's not a hugely significant increase in the number of students who are meeting the excess cost threshold. It is not, when we have talked about the rapidly rising price of tuition for the Hartford Public Schools, we're not seeing a huge increase in the number of kids going out, gen ed or special ed, right? It's been relatively flat the last couple of years. So it really comes down to two things, maybe three things. It comes down to, for the students who are receiving special ed services, how many services are they receiving? That's one issue. It comes down to the price of those services, right? The price of those services is going up faster than inflation. You're going to see these costs rise. And the third thing is, of our students who are leaving us, how many of them are going to get identified and given an IEP? And one of the things I'll highlight that, you know, we don't have, most of these students are in out-of-district placements, right? They're at private, you know, schools that are charging tuition. Now that can be students who are our students who started in the Hartford Public School, and we made the decision that they were best served in outplacement. But it can also be students who are at CREC or another magnet operator or an open choice school, and that school decides they need an out-of-district placement. But we also actually have, and I'm trying to dig into this to get you more information on this, but we have a subset of students who are meeting the excess cost threshold, meaning their costs exceed $104,000 this year, who are still served in their magnet or open choice school, meaning their school is providing services that are totaling more than $100,000, which is hard to do, right? Even with a one-to-one para, it's hard to get to $104,000. I don't believe we have a single student who is served in a Hartford public school where the individual costs for that child exceed the threshold. But we do have students in suburban schools, in open choice seats, who do exceed that threshold, even without an out-of-district placement. But we can try to give you more numbers, but essentially it is amount, level of services per student and cost of each service. So it's driving it.
Ms. Fortune, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you. I'd be curious to see the trend, I'd say over maybe the past 6 years, just so it includes pre-pandemic numbers of that trend. You said last year was 34 million, this year is 41 million. I mean, I'd be curious to know, is it growing exponentially or has it been like a constant pace? I'm inferring from what you've said, it's exponential growth, which is even more concerning. And then, you know, with respect to what you've just said, it's not the first time that I've attended one of these meetings and I sort of hear the general sense that perhaps children are receiving services that are not necessary and we're paying a lot of money for this. If we really want to be able to advocate for this at the next legislative session, I really would want to be able to have more than just trends and generalization and be able to say, without student name, here is student A who is receiving A, B, C, D, E, F, G services for this cost. right? I feel like I need to be able, any of us, if we're gonna be advocating effectively and persuasively, we need like really persuasive and good data to be able to pinpoint and not just say it in general statistics, but really exemplify one of these students to really, to really illustrate the point that we're trying to make. Because I hear this and I still am grappling with how do you effectively advocate? Because on the one hand, I could see someone saying, well, Hartford is not offering the special ed services that my child needs. So of course I bring them out and they have an IEP, right? And we've had parents testify to say, we don't have the services publicly available in a way that's user-friendly on our website like other districts have, or a number of other concerns that parents point out. So I think if we're going to be trying to use this as a source of us losing a ton of funds, or at least spending beyond what we have at the detriment of other students, I really need to be comfortable with how we're presenting that information and really detailed data to be able to make that point and feel good about making this argument.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Since Board Member Fortune did bring up the oversight of special ed outplacements, beyond scope of the meeting, but I was asked and talking to some citizens about education, and they were asking a similar question about they see students going out of district and was asking who kind of oversees these students when they go out of the district. Now, I'm making that as a request to get more detail on it. I've had some discussions with SPED staff, and so I got the notion that there is what I'm gonna call like an outplacement coordinator that somebody in the district is supposed to oversee these students, what happens to them. But I don't know the details of it, and kind of to Board Member Fortune's question, I couldn't quite answer the question with great detail. So it'd be good to know more in that area, because people do have a sense that we're sending a lot of students out of district, and that is really pricey, and then they're not even sure that students get what they need out of that relationship. And it's hard to just, you can't give a concrete answer. So I'm tabling the discussion about making the request. Can we get more detail on what this role is and what the infrastructure is and how it works? And it may even touch on this cost thing. But I did get the impression from other discussions that we've had students go out of district and then somehow they get placed in SPED once they leave our district, which significantly then adds to our costs when they weren't SPED within our district. Mm-hmm. And I'm asking it because I'm now learning that a certain amount of learning loss can lead to a SPED placement, or can. And so I'm just wondering, are we having kids who have learning loss? I mean, we could treat in a different way. Should be SPED, but again, I can't answer those questions, but it'd just be good to know that more. And so I guess, where would we place that? Is that under teaching and learning?
Could be, it is under special education, teaching and learning.
To maybe just have that be a
Cycle.
topic to.
Christina, we can talk about when the cycle, so we can add it. Yeah.
Okay.
We're certainly looking at out-of-district placement data, and to Board Member Fortune's point, we're looking at the, trying to get better quantification of the degree to which what you're describing happens. We know it does happen, but kids who leave, then they get identified, then services get applied. And so we'll get you better quantification of that.
And that is also something that we have requested the technical assistance provider from the state that's doing the special education support plan to understand what some of the drivers behind the increase, who outplaces at what rate, what are the categories for the outplacement. the health impaired, right, learning disability.
Ms. Darcel Ledger?
Yes, thank you so much. I have a couple of questions. Do we have clinical day schools at Hartford Public Schools?
Clinical day, no.
Okay, do we have any therapeutic schools or therapeutic programs like the entire school at Hartford Public Schools?
Like the what? Like say the last part?
Therapeutic, for example, like it's similar to clinical day school, but pretty much a student or students who have certain diagnoses that would require therapy throughout the day, group therapy, individual therapy, medication to be administered, perhaps restraints if necessary, things like that. Do we have that in place in Hartford Public?
No,
So,
we do have our specialized special education programs, but what I hear you describing is something that is more for clinical counseling, therapeutic supports.
right. So if a student would, a Hartford student, Hartford Public School student received a diagnosis or perhaps needed that type of level of care, and there are therapeutic, clinical day schools, therapeutic programs that will service those children, that can be very costly. However, if we attempt to keep some of these students, these children in Hartford Public Schools where their needs are not being met, then we are doing not only those students a disservice, but we are doing the other students and their families a disservice because we're not able to provide that level of care. And the children who are with those particular students, sharing the environment, attempting to learn, where those children are not, their needs are not being met, that's doing everyone a huge disservice. So I think the bigger question would be, how do we, advocate for these children, or if we don't want to send them out to the proper environment, learning environment, perhaps we should look at creating our own, not within the schools, but I mean creating clinical day school, perhaps.
We would love to create one, and that's probably something that, we'll talk to K-12, New Solutions, K-12, I'm trying to remember their name, to explore what types of programs we can either build and develop new or expand. As you know, board member Darcel Ledger, right, that requires a different set of certification and licensure. And so we would definitely have to think it out. For example, I know that our colleagues in Manchester have, the daytime component and the evening component of what you're describing. And that is also, not only do they service their students, but I know that they have seats for other districts as well. So it can be a revenue, generating opportunity as well.
And it's almost like that, if you build it, they will come. But if we see that there's a need and it is, really, it's very costly, perhaps we should look at investing and growing our own program. And I would invite, the idea of visiting some clinical day schools that already exist, just to observe and see the difference and how their programs are run, how the students feel, how some of the students who have learning differences or neurodivergent students, how their self-esteem, how they are being, just how they are thriving in these particular environments. And if they start to decompensate, how that's being handled. That's all I have to say.
Thanks, Mr. Ledger. Christina, does somebody else have?
Ms. Fortune.
Ms. Fortune?
Thank you. I just wanted to sort of underscore that my reason for the request is because it's December, the legislative session starts next month. I think, we have a legislative task force and we're trying to be better with the advocacy on that front. So this would be really helpful. And to the extent that data can help inform what funding we go after and how we ask them to tweak the formula for how they allocate funds, that would be really helpful. So for instance, if there are certain types of services that these departing students are receiving elsewhere that we don't have, maybe this is where, as Board Member Darissa Ledger said, maybe that's where we try to invest. But I'm having a hard time trying to advocate for more funds or explain that this is unfair to Hartford schools without really having just specific information. And I know you're working on this, but it would be helpful to be able to feel very comfortable with the information that we have and be able to put it in a narrative that flows easily and is persuasive.
Well, if I can speak to that too, I think we're absolutely working on it and understand the timeliness of that data. I just want to say too, there's sort of two separate conversations in a way, right? So really, I'll highlight that whether or not the system itself is unfair or we are getting the short end of the stick, if you will, relative to the structures and systems that are in place. That's one issue, right? That's where I hear you saying you need more data to understand that dynamic. But it remains true that I also want to emphasize, the point of showing this slide is not to say we don't want these students to receive these services, kind of going to Board Member Darissa Ledger's point. We want all of our students to receive all of the services that they need. But what you see on this chart is a $7 million increase from one year to the next. And so I think there's a question, and I hear you saying you need more data on that conversation about, is the system unfair? And we're working to provide that. But independent of that, we have to figure out how can we possibly continue to sustain the Hartford Public Schools with dollar increases like this without further support from the city or the state, right? Even if the system is completely fair, this is still not a sustainable increase in cost.
I would argue that it can't possibly be fair if this is going to be the continued increase, right? Because if we're continuing to have this increase year over year, yet our funding is not changing, regardless of why it's happening, it's not fair because some students are just being shortchanged by just the very definition of how this system is structured. So to be able to argue that even if we make no changes is unfair, it would help to I don't know, maybe you have that understanding, Deputy Foster, and I just don't, and it would be helpful maybe for the two of us to sit down and talk it through, but I still feel like I get it from a 30,000, foot perspective, but not, excuse me, at the detailed level, and I would just like to have that better understanding.
All right, the last thing we have here tonight, we're going to move from the 24-25 school year to the 25-26. So as we move into the budgeting process, we want to have a first conversation about where we are as we start the school year, or as we start the budgeting process. Caitlin's going to, in a minute, talk through some of the timeline, what we're thinking in terms of the timeline for the budget process. But we wanted to give you a first look at some of the numbers. And so what we're going to share with you tonight is essentially a level service budget. And so again, I won't read the slide to you, but when we're talking about with the level service budget is we're saying this is what the expenditures would be or the expenses would be in the 25-26 year if we want to have the exact same number of positions in the exact same programs in 25-26 as we have in this current 24-25 school year. So the dollars go up, And you see on the slide the reasons why, right? We have contractual increases in salaries. We might be, have software like Power School where there's a contractual increase each year in the price of software, or we might have other increases in, due to inflation and things like utilities. I also want to be really clear that what the numbers we're sharing with you tonight do not include, this is a level service budget, meaning this is the expenses to do the same 25-26 budget in terms of positions and programs as the adopted 24-25 budget. You all know that additional money was added after the adoption of the 24-25 budget. Particularly, we received $5 million in additional funding from the legislature that was very clearly one time, not recurring funding. That funding was used intentionally to restore 50 positions that had been cut as part of the FY25 budget. But without that additional $5 million continuing in FY26, we don't have the ability to carry forward those positions. So I want to be clear that when you look at the numbers we're sharing tonight, just to be clear that if we wanted to maintain those 50 positions that were brought back after the adoption, that would be another $5 million in expenses over and above what we're sharing tonight. And so on the next slide is our initial forecast of revenue. This is probably not going to look surprising to you because it looks the same as it's looked for 12 years, or relatively similar to the way it's looked for 12 years. We're projecting flat funding. Next year is the final year of the ECS increase or the ECS phase-in. And so we're supposed to be 100% full funding of the state's commitment to ECS in the 25-26 year. The reason you don't see that in our general fund is our additional ECS dollars come as part of our Alliance grant. And so they show up in the state grant line as opposed to the general fund line. And so you see that our projected ECS increase for 25-26 is only about $3.5 million more than our 24-25 ECS. And that's offset by anticipated declines, a little bit like anticipated declines in other state grants, which is why you see the state grant number going up about 2.3 million in our projection.
Can I ask a quick question on ECS about? So it looks like we had a slide that shows that our per pupil cost is actually like $20,000, right? But our 23,000. But our ECS grant is based on the actual per pupil cost being like 11,000. Is that? Am I understanding that right, or am I not understanding that right?
Well, the ECS is because there's multiple variables in the formula, right? So there's a baseline per pupil,
Oh, right.
and then there's
Okay.
additional additions for high need students,
Okay.
multilingual learners. So there's these other variables they throw in.
But yes, the baseline is still 11, and it's been like that for
For
decades.
quite some time.
Yeah,
Okay. Okay.
like mid-90s.
There's also there's a concentrated poverty factor as well, which obviously increases our number.
Understood.
Which would change if the special education, right, weight would be applied.
So we're expecting revenue to be relatively flat. I mean, you see a 0.5% increase. That's largely because we're expecting that increase in the Alliance grant. It's reflected in the final phase in of the ECS. So if you go to the next slide, this is then our projected expenditures, and we can break this out in detail in terms of things like the other non-personnel. But let me just walk through these categories because what I included in the breakout are the biggest cost drivers in the budget. And so what you see is personnel expenses, so that's salary and fringe. And, we're projecting a 3.4% increase. That is inclusive of contractual raises and inclusive of the 5 unions. But we just settled the administrators. At the December meeting, we're bringing the teachers' contract forward. We're still negotiating with secretaries, security guards, and paraeducators, but we built into this assumptions about where those increases might land. So that 3.4% is largely driven by collective bargaining contractual increases. Tuition, I think earlier there was a question, I think Board Member Fortune, you asked about, the longer trend, and we'll get that longer trend on the excess costs. But the 7.7% is really a weighted average of what we've been seeing in tuition increases over the last 10 years. So our best way of projecting tuition forward is to look at our recent history. And so we're projecting that 7.7% increase in tuition. Transportation, 4.2%. Again, that's a weighted average of our recent history. Same as utilities, expecting a smaller 1.6%. And then all other non-personnel, that's a little harder to pin down. We have 2.7, but the way we came to that is applying anticipated percent increases across sort of all of the different line items in the budget to come up with where we think it's going to land. And you see that 2.7%, but keep in mind that's an increase of 869,000. So even though it's this sort of umbrella of all other non-personnel, it's a pretty small share of the total expected increase. And just, the bottom line number, and again, this is the level service budget. It does not include the 50 positions restored after the adoption of the 24-25 budget. Expenses go from 454 to 474. So a change of about 20 million. So again, revenue going up 2 million, expenditures going up 20 million. That's gonna put us into a deficit. And that's, and overall, again, you see a 4.4% projected increase.
Oh, thank you, Chair.
Sorry.
Trying to be formal.
Sorry.
Anyways. This is just a comment on transportation. I've elevated that to people as kind of a part of the big three of the expenses. I'm gonna ask, as you move forward in this, that you find a way to break out transportation costs for general education students, maybe going to open choice, and the cost for SPED students. Occasionally, again, there's a perception that somehow if we mitigated or eliminated open choice, somehow we could drive that number down. And I think what we learned last year is that's not really the case, that most of this is SPED money. And so open choice doesn't really impact that transportation number. It just may be worthwhile to break it out. You could see it clearly.
We can certainly break it out. So I'll go ahead. The next slide then shows the balance sheet, if you will, and we can talk about mitigation, right? Because we always make assumptions and like how are we going to mitigate potential deficit. So I wanted you to see, the numbers in the leftmost column are, these are from our budget, right? This was our adopted budget where we had 454 in expenses against 429 million in revenue. And the way we anticipated mitigating that $25 million gap, a 5% vacancy assumption in the 24-25 school year, the use of the ESSER and the use of the non-lapsing fund that we talked about earlier this evening, as well as the budget task to solve over the course of the year. Those were the assumptions made to achieve a balanced budget last year. We know we wanted ESSER in 25-26. We might have 600,000 in the non-lapsing fund. We won't have the 5.6 million that we had last year. And right now we're assuming we're not going to try to include a budget task to solve during the year. We are assuming vacancy savings. Now we put that at 4% at this point. Obviously our vacancies are much higher, but we've talked a lot about the work we're trying to do to solve for our vacancies. So we don't want to put that vacancy assumption too high, knowing all the efforts going into trying to fill those vacancies. And so if we have a 4% vacancies and we have the sort of 0.5% increase in revenue, 4.5% increase in expenses, pull out that vacancy savings, we're looking at about 34 million as the problem we have to solve for in building the FY26 budget. And if the priority was, and there were good reasons for the positions we restored with the one-time state funding. If the priority is to sustain those 50 positions again in the 25-26 year, you need to make that $34 million, $39 million. Because that's not, again, this is reflecting a level service against the adopted budget.
If I can real quick, I think as we head into our conversations with legislators and, or going out and trying to advocate for more dollars, I also think it would be really helpful if we had a sense of other ways to, like, trying to help ourselves first, right? Like, what are ways that we can save? What does that delta mean? And, what will we have to cut in order to close that gap?
Internally at anywhere?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, so at least we have a sense, right, when we do go talk to legislators of this is what we're doing, this is what we've been doing, or it really is just because, special ed costs have just skyrocketed, just like a different, at least personally for me, right, like when I look at this, I'm like, we just need more money, but I feel like I need more talking points than that, and I think that those kind of conversations would be really, really helpful.
So, we do have to build the budget, right, without assuming that we're gonna get the money. And so we'll do what you're asking, plus build a budget that has, mitigation.
Well, in all of this, I will say too, we have to situate to the superintendent's point, we have to build a budget, so we're gonna be identifying those things, and we're obviously gonna be having conversations with you all about what are your priorities relative to keeping or cutting, but, you know, all of this has to be situated in the context of the budget we went through last year, right? And there was, as you all know, significant cutting at the central office and the school level, and so anything we're doing this year is, you know, building on that, right?
May I add to this?
I'm sorry.
As we get the numbers as to what proposed cuts we would do if we don't get more funding and so on, I also just asked to have, again, the narrative to go with that, to cut, you know, $50,000 somewhere. What does that mean? Who goes without a critical service? Because at this point, we're already operating on the edge. Anything that we're cutting is probably a necessity, and someone's going without a key service. I would really want to be able to illustrate to whoever, you know, to the legislature, what exactly we're cutting and paint that picture for them. You know, I mean, for example, for me, the 10% vacancy was really an abstract number until a parent came and testified at one of our board meetings and said her child showed up to school for a sustained period of time. There was no math teacher, no STEM teacher, no science teacher, and no English teacher, 4 core subjects, right? I feel like we need to be able to illustrate that for them when we're going to say we need more money, and also point out the things that we've been going without, right? Not just what we cut, but the things we've been going without. Like Hartford teachers are getting paid less now than their counterparts in other districts. And the shortages, the vacancies we've had, all these other things that we haven't had and we haven't had for a long period of time, that really is not acceptable. Like, we already are in a crisis situation. I think it's also okay to point this out to them and make them understand where we are and how we've been operating and trying to make do with what we have, but what we have just is not enough.
And part of that has to be also what we have been doing in our attempts to, not just to mitigate, but to attract new staff, support them when they're here. Because I hear that often, well, you know, why don't you offer hiring incentives? Or, you know, where's your pipeline program? And so we have to keep reminding, to go with the narrative. It's the narrative of what we have done already and how it has helped or not.
Just one thing I'll add too, in terms of telling that story of both the impact of our reductions, but also, right, I mean, you know, if I'm a legislator and I see Hartford's saying they need their expenses to go up by $20 million, right? I could imagine a legislator saying, you know, no, just level fund it, right? Like, and just to be clear, like, we can get you a precise number, but a sizable chunk of that, approaching 50% of that, is staff salaries, and some of that is projected based on collective bargaining, because we know that a driver of our recruitment retention issue is our salaries not being competitive, and we are working to solve for that in our collective bargaining, and there's a cost to that. And like, we didn't feel like we could go into collective bargaining and just say, nope, nobody's getting a raise, because that's just going to magnify our vacancy issue. But I think that has to be part of the story that we're telling around why we see this expenditure increase.
But I was gonna say that also making sure that while there will be increases in salary, that is not an escape route, right, for others. Because still, we will not be fully comparable, and still will be significantly less than an Avon, for example.
Yes, so, but spiking that out, that we've got to get better, so I do think that be part of that narrative. I wanted to add on some discussion about school closures and consolidations. They're real, I'm not mentioning it, but at least internally, can we assess if there's any real savings there? Not advocating it. My suspicion is savings there may not be as great as we believe. And I think if that's the case, then maybe let's put them on the table, because there's some anxiety, because we've had a lot of when we've had closures, it's been of community schools, and so clearly there's some anxiety around that. And it floats up the question of, well, why can't magnet schools be consolidated and closed? Why must only community schools?
So the magnet school funding that's attached to it.
Well, let's fight that out. So even that, let's balance and weigh it, right? Does the magnet school funding really pay for itself? Right? Is it a net gain for us, or is it fool's gold with chasing something that? Because I can't answer the question. So let me say it in a broader way. So one thing is the school closure thing, and really talk about, because if there's nothing there, then maybe we can take off the table that we're gunning for school closures as a way of closing the gap. The other thing is people in the community have a vague sense that Chef versus O'Neill is driving some of the erosion and cost imbalances because somehow we're funding all this magnet school activity or other activities. Is there a way of spiking out how much of our costs are driven by these Chef versus O'Neill initiatives? Another way of saying that is, would we really have 39 schools? If Chef versus O'Neill was off the table, would we really have 39 schools? We really have that many different programs? Or would we do things in a different way?
For you, Madam Chair, not to disagree with anything you said, just for the record. But I feel like that's probably the level of research that would require to figure out the exact financial drain of Chef versus O'Neill would probably need to be something that we contract out, because or like get a school leader, or a deal or something. It's like, I don't necessarily think that to get the answer that you want would require heavy research time and a lot of back research, right? Like, it's not just a current problem, it's a how much has this drained the system versus benefited the system. And not that nobody here is qualified to do that, but I feel like that's such a heavy ask to get the answer that we really need, which is how effective has Chef versus O'Neill been in solving this issue?
Yes, I get what you're saying. So I'm asking somebody to figure out how to fly the right level, because I don't want to make it a bean counting exercise,
Right.
But there ought to be a way to tell a story of, in the pursuit of somehow addressing this social isolation and things of that nature. And the reason I'm saying that Board Member Mills is because, like, someone posed a question to me, okay, everyone agrees that social isolation should be addressed. Their question is, well, why don't we just set seats out at Harvard Public High School and said, we want to have social isolation, let's get our suburbanites to come here. Let's incentivize them to go there. If they don't want to go there, then they don't come. Why must we set up these schools A, B, C, D, E, F that has that same goal? And I can't answer like, yeah, why do we have these 5 other magnet schools who really have the express purpose of dealing with, right? So I'll be some way to say, because we got to have these 5 schools, there's some kind of additional cost that we're having to absorb because we have to somehow fulfill this need to not have the social isolation. Because in reality, they just won't come to Harvard Public Schools, they won't come to Buckley, or they won't go to some brand next other school. Just, that's all. Because I couldn't answer that question for people when they asked me.
Ms. Brody, I see your hand raised, but just 1 second. I wondered, Superintendent, did you want to jump in there? I felt like maybe.
I was trying to see how, I mean, there is a stipulated agreement. Right, so like that has to be at least a base response.
Right.
Right, that it's not that Hartford. There's a stipulated agreement, and those are the number of magnets, and those are the number of seats, and we have to kind of play by those rules for the time being.
Maybe people don't know quite that.
Perhaps.
That story.
Yeah, no, I hear you.
They're not necessarily
I hear
attributed to you per
I hear
se.
you.
They know it's associated with that. But the idea of,
Right, it's statutory requirement.
right, but people definitely feel like
And we're just doing it ourselves?
No, they know that it's hurting Harvard Public Schools. Because there's a certain way people don't see the schools that fulfill the Sheff versus O'Neill requirement as being Harvard Public Schools, because they weren't organically created by us. They were, do you see what I'm saying? Because in people's head, they keep saying, because the question they ask, like some people, that the task they give us is, how can you help us kill Sheff versus O'Neill? Because in their head, kill Sheff versus O'Neill, X number of schools will go away. That money would somehow then flow back into the district, and our district schools would somehow get that.
So we have to go back and do some, just background knowledge setting. I think for the community, that would be probably helpful.
Yes, I
Yeah.
say so, to at least explain, because you could get the sense that people will feel like this shortage will be on the backs of local schools, because somehow, because of our requirements, the magnet schools somehow seem untouchable in some way.
Ms. Brody?
I'm not gonna belabor the point, but I'm hoping we will have a separate conversation on that subject. And to answer Tyrone's question, absolutely not. We would not have 39, however many schools we have. We would not have that many schools. And like I remember I described before how state education funding goes. If you're thinking about all the the magnet is funded first, then all other districts get their portion, including the Hartford portion. Because think about it, Hartford, we have magnets, but this magnet thing is CREC heavy. That's why CREC even exists. So is a conversation worth having. It is not as complicated as we think. It doesn't require a whole lot of research. It's been dissected over decades. And it is a protected group of schools. And everyone else has to get what's available after. But I'm hoping that we can have a conversation solely on this subject separately.
Okay.
We have one more slide. No, thank you. Caitlin.
Yes, I can wrap this up. And I will say, we're gonna crosswalk the budget timeline with the legislative timeline, because what I'm hearing is definitely having the data and the narrative to advocate for those different state levers, but also what we would have to do if those levers don't happen. So this is just along the lines of, we do have to have a budget, and so this is the timeline for that piece. Aiming for an April 15th board vote on the budget, those backwards maps from that. You can see now in December is when we're talking with you, kind of giving that overview of FY26. You can see the board role, the community role, and school teams role is how we're thinking about this. And again, continuing to come to you over the course of the spring as we develop this alongside public forums with the community and discussions with community partners, with union leadership. And one piece too that I know I've heard some feedback about and I'm particularly passionate about is those school team engagement. So how principals are really thinking about their building and thinking about their budget strategically and how they're aligning that to the data they have for their particular school and context and community. So that will be a piece as well, just making sure they have the knowledge and training to know how to use the tools that we have and the information available to them financially. So that's kind of that last piece too, is making sure our school teams are able to engage in this process.
Can I add that the other crosswalk is with the strategic plan?
Yes, I meant to say that too. Yes, strategic plan and legislative advocacy is what we'll crosswalk this with. Yeah, good call.
That's all from us, yes.
Okay. Any last questions from anyone? Well, thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you, board members, for the conversation. Thank you, Paul and Caitlin and Superintendent, for your input tonight. Just in case this is the first time you're tuning in since we announced it, we do have a community engagement, open office hours. I don't think we've quite established what we're gonna call it, on Saturday, December 14th, from 10 to 11:30 at Park Street Library in Hartford. So we hope that you will join us. There's no real agenda, really just kind of an open time to talk to board members and just have a chance to get to know us and ask us questions. So we look forward to seeing those who are able to make it. They won't all be on Saturdays going forward. This was just our first attempt to get one on the calendar. December's been a busy month, so we look forward to seeing you in December.